Welcome, everyone. In this week's Torah portion, Parashat Vayishlakh, we're witness to the reconciliation between Jacob and Esau, and that reconciliation is preceded by Jacob's wrestling with a mysterious stranger. And even without the 3,000 years of interpretation on this story, we're to understand when we read it that Jacob is also wrestling with himself, and that there's something core to this wrestling that's part of our tradition and its ultimate moral and spiritual vision. And this week, I'm led and inspired by Rabbi Amy Eilberg and her book From Enemy to Friend, which appeared about 5 or 6 years ago. And the book is really predicated on the radical notion that when we seek to end conflict, we're not ending something that is other from ourselves, but we're actually transforming conflict. And in order to do that, we have to engage in a powerful, radical inner work so that we change, and by our change, so the conflict itself dissipates through that change. And Rabbi Amy Eilberg looks to something that she calls a hermeneutic of peacemaking, which is to say, part of that inner work that we do is to look at our traditions and find the peacemaking impulse within them. And that by doing that, we ourselves contribute to the work of peace building. And so, of course, the story of Jacob and Esau features prominently and centrally in that work. And in the Jacob and Esau story, the wrestling really boils down to one verse that says that Jacob, mixing up my Hebrew and English, that Vayivater Yaakov levado, that Jacob was left by himself, Vayevek ish imo, and that he struggled. The initial verb seems to suggest that he struggled with himself, but then it says he struggled with an ish, a being, imo, with him. And of course, the interpretive history of this parsha revolves around these central questions of who is this being and what was the struggle about. Now, a number of answers are given for who this being is throughout our tradition. In the Midrash, it says that the being was Esau's guardian angel. Other parts of the tradition say it was an angel of God, especially for Jacob. And yet a more modern interpretation might be that Jacob was struggling with his own conscience. But remarkably, all of these interpretations are wrapped up in a comment from the early 12th century by Rashbam, who was the grandson of Rashi. And what he says about this mysterious stranger is that, yes, indeed, it was a messenger of God, but it was a messenger of God who was sent to Jacob so that Jacob could wrestle with his own conscience, and so that he would not turn away from the conflict with Esau as he had run away from other conflicts in his life. Now, just psychologically, that's such a powerful interpretation, right? That the essence of conflict is the struggle with one's own deepest sense of self. But here it is, right in our tradition, centrally hardwired into it, that the key to the reconciliation of this conflict with Esau is Jacob's wrestling with himself and the imperative to face that conflict. Now, in our Torah discussion this morning, our deep dive into the weekly Torah portion, someone raised the basic but I think essential question is, well, why is Jacob such a paradigm for our tradition? Why is he both our spiritual ancestor on the one hand and sort of the spiritual archetype of our tradition on the other? And it's easy to jump to certain kinds of answers, but it's an important question because there's nothing more inherently good about Jacob over Esau in the story. In fact, if anything, Esau has shown himself to be the more successful, the more protected, and the more worthy of the two brothers in this. But there's something that I think that goes to the heart of what Rabbi Amy Eilberg is trying to express here, this radical notion that by transforming ourselves, we transform the world around us. And she cites a theory of conflict, that the real pain of conflict is not that it frustrates our ambitions, not that it prevents us from getting what we want, but rather that it alienates us from ourselves, that things happen when we perpetuate conflict, where we do things that we don't like, that we find offensive, that we don't recognize ourselves. And so that means that the essential work of changing conflict is to transform ourselves. And so to return to this question of why is this story so central to Jewish tradition? Well, in the context of the Torah And the Torah's sort of retrospective point of view is trying to account for the sense of division in this world and the difference between the power and might of the nation of Edom, which was seen as they were seen as the descendants of Esau. And to try to account for that, they go back to these foundation stories. And there's some powerful implications that come out of this. One is that power, wealth, and strength are meaningless, as embodied by Esau and as embodied by Jacob's early ambitions. And then on top of that, the wish for domination that Jacob shows earlier and the powerful ambition that he shows earlier also are not only meaningless and futile, but they're destructive. They're destructive to him and they're destructive to the people around him. And so all that's left is the opportunity to look at oneself and to see how one relates to the world and to see how open one can be to the other. And the Torah posits this as perhaps the only compelling response to a world in which power reigns supreme, in which violence is ever present, and human suffering is inevitable. And so by going inward and engaging in this struggle to make manifest our fullest humanity, perhaps that's how we begin to alleviate that pain and violence and suffering, and thereby bringing some healing to this world. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Shabbat Shalom. I hope you're all well and staying safe. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Shabbat Shalom.